Hello, thanks for tuning in to Module 2, Australian Education. You'll now be familiar with the pattern of presenting these topics. So Topic 6 has been broken down into three key concepts. These are the evolution of education in Australia, the Australian education system, and Australian education aspirations and agendas. In this video, I'll present a brief overview of Topic 6.1, the evolution of education in Australia. I hope it helps to inform your thinking about Module 2's theme of being an educator. The Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australians informs the content presented in Topic 6. You can find a copy of this reading in the Text and Readings tab in the Learning site. To set the scene, I've chosen a photo from my own family album. Looking at this picture, and with this topic in mind, prompts me to reflect on the very different education experiences we each would have been having when this picture was taken. Given this photo was taken almost 60 years ago, I'm sure my siblings and I had very different childhoods and educations to children of similar ages today. Take a moment to think about your own education experiences. Were they positive, exciting, challenging, or frightening? How might your experiences act as a benchmark for what you might regard as a cultural norm about education? Knowing a little of the rich and complex story of the evolution of education in Australia will not only help you to reflect on the conditions that shaped this rich story, but your own lived experiences of education and care in Australia. It will help you apply a critical lens and think more deeply about the practice traditions formed over time that continue to influence the way we educate children and young people in Australia. It's estimated that at the time of European settlement, there were approximately 260 languages spoken by 750,000 Indigenous Australians, who, as you can see from this map, lived in various tribal communities. Aboriginal children were educated and cared for by their family and others in these communities. Whilst it's not possible to describe a generic image of childhood at this time, we do know that children had toys, played games, and were taught ways of knowing the world in which they lived. Education was viewed as a holistic experience, much as it is in early childhood settings today. That is, everything all day is learning. And so, as we start this chronology, we acknowledge and respect Indigenous peoples as the first educators of Australia's children and young people. When the 11 ships of the First Fleet anchored in Botany Bay, there were 26 children and a number of pregnant women on board. By 1800, there were 725 European children, 34 of whom were orphans, in the colony now called New South Wales. You can hear more about the history of the children of the First Fleet by following the link on the screen there. Using primary sources such as newspapers and letters, Fabian and Lowe have collated a cultural discursive summary of the ways various groups of children were viewed at this time. Aboriginal children were diseased, dispossessed and destroyed. Convict children had adult workloads and punishments. Free children were healthier and more independent than their peers in Europe, and upper-class children were groomed to rule. It's very interesting to note that no formal arrangements for education had been factored into the planning of settling the colonies. And so, as the colonies expanded, the number of uneducated and lawless children continued to grow. Citizens of the time maintained that crime was a result of ignorance and that ignorance was a result of lack of education, and therefore education would decrease crime and increase productivity. Something had to be done, and so it was. Governor Macquarie arrived in the colony of New South Wales in 1810, charged with the responsibility to restore order and establish social cohesion. Macquarie commissioned the first schools and orphanages for the education and care of European and Aboriginal children. During this period, a variety of education and care services emerged. As was the custom in Europe, these were collectively called schools. These included cottage schools, which were run by entrepreneurs for profit, public schools, which were run by governments and churches and charged fees, orphan and mission schools, which again were run by governments and churches and were provided fee relief for those who couldn't afford it to pay full fees, and private schools, which paid fees, again run by the government and the church. There were also homeschooling, which was generally conducted by a governess or a tutor for quite substantial fees. Note that each service could only be accessed by those who had money to pay for the fees charged, even those who might get some fee relief. These schools were primarily focused on technical aims and intentions, namely to discipline the children of the colonies so they may one day contribute to the workforce, the exception being those from the upper class who were groomed for positions of authority. It's important to note that at this time there were no age restrictions on attendance to school. Following the European trend, Australia's colonies passed Public Instruction Acts, making school free, compulsory and secular. These acts across the various colonies heralded the beginning of mass compulsory education across the states and rendered schooling a public service and teachers public servants. The 1872 rules for teachers illustrate the rights or lack thereof and responsibilities of teachers at the time. For instance, Rule 6 states, women teachers who marry or engage in unseemly conduct will be dismissed. Due to the economic pressures of the Depression from 1893 to 1895, children under the age of 5 were excluded from schools. Kindergartens and preschools were established to provide education and care for children from 3 to 5 years, and nurseries were established to care for children from birth to 5 years. This period of time saw the setting up of the division between the compulsory and the pre-compulsory school sectors. Between 1900 and 1950, Australia moved through a period of rapid and extensive change. Starting with the Federation in 1901, social, cultural and political changes were evidenced in the education and care services provided over this period. Catalysts of change included those nominated on the screen, such as the Federation of the Colonies, 2 world wars, less emphasis on the mother country, mass immigration via schemes like the Snowy River Hydro scheme, the rise of trade unions, population explosion, and the women's movement gaining access to voting, jobs and wages, federal interventions in education and health, and childcare reforms and funding. This shifting social, cultural and political landscape influenced changes in the pre-compulsory and compulsory school sectors. This is a particularly interesting time to consider in light of your essay question. The Federation of Australia States cemented the notion of state-governed and funded education in the compulsory sector. However, European and American influences prevailed. Pedagogy was based on mass education formations and theories. Students following Locke's theory were viewed as tabula rasa, as in blank slates. The curriculum was borrowed from the British, and success was equated with the memorisation of facts. Struggling to accommodate the population boom, class sizes were large, and the schools served as a selection ladder, particularly for the public service. Gender-based subjects prevailed, like girls did sewing, the boys did woodwork, and during this period of time, teachers were trained at colleges and certified to teach. Between 1950, in the pre-compulsory sector, this was also a time of great growth and marked expansion and investment. The welfare of infants became a national concern, as Australia had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world at the time. Introduction of child endowment, in the Western world I should say. Introduction of child endowment pension payments were made to try and compensate for the very poor in the communities. Free kindergarten and the child study movement emerged. Creches and day nurseries which were later to become long day care, emerged for working families. Pre-compulsory sector was very strongly influenced by Froebel and Montessori, and teachers again were trained in colleges and certified to teach. Between 1950 and 2000, Australia continued to grow and change. This period reflects a time of unrest and consolidation in relation to the social, cultural and economic imperatives influencing the education and care of children and young people. Some of the events there that you can see were the Vietnam War, again multiculturalism post the White Australia policy, the anti-establishment sentiments of particularly anti-American sentiments after the Vietnam War, and again the population explosion continued to overtake birth rate for the first time. Immigration, we had more people coming to Australia. The population was rising at a greater rate than birth rate. A really important thing in this period of time was the advent of free university education, and the feminist movement in 1972 affected equal pay for women. Federal childcare reforms and funding restructures continued or emerged and continued through this time of economic boom and nation building. In terms of the what was happening, that was what's happening in society. What was happening in the compulsory school sector was this urban drift. People were leaving farms and coming to live into living the towns and cities where the jobs were. And there were changes to subjects and skills such as typing, which I think this photo on the top right-hand corner is really interesting. Children touch typing without being able to see the keys. It was a politically active time. 1979 was the year of the child. Careers advisors and counsellors started to emerge in schools, trying to harness the competitive job market available. Vocational education options such as TAFE and VET programs emerged, and mass education approaches following outcomes and standards-based education were the norm. It was during this period of time too, at the very end of this period, when international and national benchmarking emerged. The first PISA test took place in the year 2000. The move away from single-sex schools and subjects to mixed-gender schools and subjects, and again, due to the population boom, the class sizes were still rather large. Should have changed the photo. So the evolution of, in the pre-compulsory sector, we've got, again, this notion of the increased workforce. There was a shortage of staff and facilities. Increased migration was a real tension in the pre-compulsory sector because most of the people working and teaching in that sector were monolingual, so there was a real issue with migrant families. A really important milestone in the pre-compulsory sector was the Child Care Act passed in 1972, which increased the access and demand to preschool services particularly, the emergence of community-based preschools and the wider range of theories and programs being implemented, particularly the influence of the Reggio Emilia and a strong influence of developmentally appropriate programs. Education and care was fragmented due to different governance, but there were much higher participation rates at this time. To conclude, I just want you to think about the practice traditions established during these years and consider how or if they continue to shape the lived experience of Australia's children and young people. This brief overview has, I hope, helped establish the practice landscape of Australian education and provide some insights into how many of these traditions were formed over time. And it does serve as a reminder that education is a political, historical and cultural act.